every 3 days. Elevators around the world transport a number of people nearly equal to the global population of 8 billion. This makes elevators the most frequently used form of transportation in the world. The more frequently they are used, the greater the risks. To date, there have been numerous cases where poor quality elevators put into service posed certain hazards that we sometimes could not foresee, affecting the lives of those who entered them. However, malfunctions in the elevators themselves are not the only factors at play, as there have been tragic accidents caused by terrifying coincidences. These incidents are rarely spoken of, even once, such as in Taipei, where one particular elevator's surrounding factors are so eerie that they leave people worried, frightened, and asking themselves, "Will I meet my end here?" When mentioning Taipei, many immediately think of Taiwan's capital, known for its far-reaching subway system, glittering department stores, brightly lit bars and food stalls, and its trendy, state-of-the-art exhibitions, always offering visitors an extraordinary and refreshing experience. However, the unique charm of Taipei lies not only in its modernity, but also in the presence of old houses in shades of grey and brown, capturing a truly traditional aesthetic. These historic buildings have become so popular as tourist attractions that entire districts dedicated to sightseeing can be found close to downtown Taipei. Sangsha District in New Taipei City is one of the bustling areas filled with new apartment complexes. Among them is a building named Tiangsha Zushi, a 12-story complex that appears quite well maintained, complete with elevators and security cameras. But look closely, there's something strange about this place. Why does the building have 2 separate elevator areas? It's because this is a multifunctional building, utilized not only for residential purposes, but also leased for various business needs, such as retail and medical services, in order to avoid disturbing the residents living there. The building has a dedicated elevator, referred to as Elevator A, exclusively for business establishments, and it only goes up to the 7th floor. Meanwhile, residents have a separate entrance to access the other 2 elevators, referred to as Elevators B and C, which can reach up to the 12th floor. This division shows that even strangers can enter the building if they want to access the businesses from the 1st to the 7th floor. However, they can only use one elevator, which is Elevator A. Returning to the businesses in this building, among the many establishments, a long-renowned nursing facility on the 5th floor specializes in neurological treatment, called Onthan Rehabilitation Center. This facility has been in operation for many years and is frequently visited by locals for trusted medical care. Generally, all activities here proceed normally for both businesses and their visitors, similar to any other residential complex. Until one day, this Elevator A caused a tragic incident on January 14th, 2010, at around 4:27 p.m. It was a day that seemed as ordinary as any other. Perhaps because it was not yet the end of the workday, the building appeared rather quiet, with few people coming and going. According to the camera footage, only one middle-aged woman, 48 years old, surnamed Tran, one of the many patients at the clinic on the 5th floor of the building, entered Elevator A, designated for the business floors. Tran's reason for being here traces back to her youth, when she suffered from a mild mental disorder and received long-term treatment at the Wencheng Rehabilitation Center. Fortunately, with early intervention, her physical health and behavior improved significantly. As a result, her family did not accompany her to the clinic this time. Today, Aunt Tran entered the building alone and was about to take the elevator to the 5th floor. As per the usual steps, Aunt Tran would press the button and wait for the elevator to ascend to the 5th floor. From the moment the elevator door opened on the 1st floor to reaching the 5th floor, the entire process would take no more than 30 seconds. However, perhaps because she was too relaxed, Aunt Tran made a mistake when pressing the floor button. Instead of pressing the 5th floor, she unknowingly pressed the button for the 6th floor. Throughout the elevator ride, Aunt Tran remained unaware that she had pressed the wrong button. So, less than half a minute later, when the elevator doors opened, she was greatly confused, as the familiar scene of the clinic was instead a steel door, and she didn't realize she had reached the wrong floor. Instinctively, Aunt Tran stepped outside to take a look around. At this moment, something unexpected happened. Since the elevator had arrived at the 6th floor as selected, and Aunt Tran had stepped completely out, the elevator doors naturally closed automatically. In less than 3 seconds, Aunt Tran found herself separated from the elevator. The surveillance camera in the elevator recorded the doors closing automatically after Aunt Tran stepped out. The footage of Aunt Tran pauses here. So, what happened to this woman later that day and in the days that followed? Aunt Tran's family continued searching in various areas outside the building. Even with police assistance, combing through thoroughly did not help them find any trace of her. They never suspected that, at this very moment, Aunt Tran was still inside the building, until the night of the 7th day after Aunt Tran's disappearance. A 76-year-old man named Zhong hurried to this building to visit his daughter, who lived on floor B. Even more strangely and puzzlingly, that night, Mr. Zhong, who was eagerly awaiting his daughter, intended to go to the 7th floor but accidentally pressed the button for the 6th floor, the very floor Aunt Tran had mistakenly selected many nights before. And as the elevator doors on the 6th floor slowly opened, you can imagine the terrifying scene that unfolded. In less than half a minute, the old man saw the most horrifying sight of his life. As soon as the elevator arrived and the doors opened, Aunt Tran's body collapsed backward into the elevator. It was now 8:30 p.m. Mr. Zhong was so terrified, he nearly felt his heart leap out of his chest. What was even more terrifying was that, having been dead for several days, the victim's body had begun to stiffen. When the elevator doors opened, her body didn't lie flat on the floor, but had slumped against one side of the elevator door. In a kneeling position, her face tilted upward, staring directly at Mr. Zhang. His legs felt numb as he stumbled into the corner of the elevator, utterly terrified. But Mr. Zhang didn't press the button to go back down, because Aunt Tran's body was now wedged in the elevator door, preventing it from closing. The scene before him remained frozen in place, unmoving in front of Mr. Zhang. Let's imagine this scene. Suppose you're in an elevator, the doors suddenly open, and then a corpse suddenly leans against the side of the elevator, blocking the doors from closing. You can't leave the elevator, and you can't make it go down. In front of you is a corpse, forcing you to confront it, with no way to escape. Let's imagine this scene. Suppose you're in an elevator, the doors suddenly open, and then a corpse suddenly leans against the side of the elevator, blocking the doors from closing. The CCTV footage showed Mr. Trong's shock and fear as he froze from the unexpected and terrifying sight. In front of the old man in the elevator, he was so terrified that he couldn't move for a long time, unsure of what to do. After a moment of thinking, he took out his phone and called his daughter for help. His daughter, too, had no solution, so she asked the manager for help. The manager yelled from the gap on the 7th floor, "Sir, move the victim's body into the elevator. Be careful not to get stuck in the door. Can you hear me?" But no matter how much his daughter and the manager tried to convince him, Mr. Jung couldn't bring himself to touch the body of the woman, which reeked of a strong odor. Just imagining seeing a dead body is already terrifying enough, so who could possibly bear touching a corpse in such a cramped space for so long? The building manager then tried to contact the owner on the 6th floor to unlock the door, but couldn't reach them. By 9:10 p.m., seeing no progress, the manager bluntly told Mr. Jang that there was no one living on the 6th floor, and the only way out of this situation was to move Aunt Tran's body into the elevator. At this point, Mr. Jong had been alone, facing the corpse in the elevator for 40 minutes. After a fierce internal struggle, he suppressed his fear, closed his eyes, and quietly moved Aunt Tran's body into the elevator, quickly pressing the button to go down to the 1st floor. And so, Mr. Jang, along with a decaying woman's body, slowly descended from the 6th floor to the 1st floor. Can you imagine the heavy feeling Mr. Jung must have experienced during this short period of time? Although he was about to escape from the difficult situation he had endured for nearly an hour, I imagine that every last second, as the elevator descended, Mr. Jung must have wished for it to pass as quickly as possible. The preliminary autopsy results estimated that Aunt Tran had died on Thursday, trapped in the elevator. According to the police investigation, a truth was revealed. The iron gate near the elevator on the 6th floor had been there, unopened, for the past 3 days. At this moment, all the investigators looked at each other in confusion, wondering what horrifying thing had happened to Aunt Tran during the 3 days before her death. From the moment Aunt Tran stepped out of the elevator, when the surveillance cameras could no longer record anything related to her, the police deduced that at the first moment she was trapped. Like anyone else in her subconscious, Aunt Tran must have tried to open the iron gate. However, after realizing in horror that the iron gate was tightly locked, she must have tried in vain to force it open, but was unable to do so. In front of her was the locked gate, and behind her, the elevator doors had already closed. In other words, Aunt Tran was trapped between the iron gate and the elevator. The gap was only a mere 40 centimeters, and an adult trapped here couldn't squat or lie down. This meant that from the moment she got trapped, Aunt Tran had no choice but to remain standing. Imagine yourself in this scenario, trapped with no options to sit or lie down, facing a closed elevator door and a locked gate. In a normal situation, if any of us encountered this, we would likely think to quickly call the owner of the 6th floor to open the gate for us, while also quickly pressing the elevator button to go up or down again, to reopen the elevator doors and escape from this awkward situation. At least for an ordinary person, these would be the two most basic methods of self-rescue. Although at that time the victim had no surveillance cameras, I believe that the victim, trapped behind the iron gate, would have tried to use these two methods to save herself. But why couldn't Aunt Tran call anyone? In reality, what is even more tragic is that in the seconds that followed, the victim had to face 3 more harsh truths. The first truth: the entire 6th floor of this building was owned by a person who disliked being disturbed by strangers. So despite clearly violating the building's safety regulations, the owner of the 6th floor had locked the iron gate outside the elevator to prevent outsiders from entering. But wait, why was the iron gate installed near the elevator? Wouldn't a thief also be able to go up via the stairs? Let me explain the situation of Taiwanese buildings at that time for you to understand. In Taiwanese buildings, you rely on security doors on each floor, and the security door on the 6th floor of this building could only be opened from the inside, not from the outside. Let me explain the situation of Taiwanese buildings at that time for you to understand. In Taiwanese buildings, you rely on security doors on each floor, and the security door on the 6th floor of this building could only be opened from the inside, not from the outside. Generally, the door from the stairs is secure, but the side near the elevator is not. More tragically, the narrow iron door left her body and hands trapped. Despite her efforts, Mrs. Tran could not reach the elevator buttons. The second truth: the owner of the 6th floor had moved away to another city long ago, meaning the entire 6th floor was unoccupied. Besides Mrs. Tran, no one else was on the 6th floor, leaving her isolated in a 40 cm space. The third truth: Mrs. Tran did not have her phone, leaving her unable to call anyone for help. Can you imagine the despair the victim must have felt? Time passed, and no one in the 5th floor clinic knew that Mrs. Tran was trapped on the floor above. Her family at home was also unaware of what had happened. What unfortunate circumstance put her in this life-threatening position, stuck between the iron gates? Mrs. Tran wished she could go back to the elevator, but that was impossible. She wanted to escape the iron gate, but that was impossible too. She hoped to call for help from someone on the 6th floor, but sadly, there was no one there. No one could possibly imagine the despair and fear Aunt Tran must have felt during the time she was trapped in that narrow space. How terrifying it must have been. All we know is that, after many days without being discovered, it's certain that Aunt Tran went without food, water, and couldn't sit down to rest due to the cramped space. She could only stand still and wait in vain. I believe that, at her most desperate moment, the victim would have wondered, doesn't my family realize I'm missing? When reviewing the surveillance footage, didn't they notice that I had gone up to the 6th floor? It can be said that by simply reviewing the surveillance footage, Aunt Tran's family could have searched and helped her quickly. How is it possible that Aunt Tran was trapped for days and nights, facing death so close? The answer to these questions might cause many people, especially the victim's family, to feel grief and frustration. In fact, on the day of the incident, right as evening fell, the family realized Mrs. Tran hadn't returned home. They immediately went to the 5th floor clinic to look for her. However, since the clinic hadn't seen her, they didn't know she was trapped on the 6th floor. And when her family asked, they replied that she hadn't come by. Based on this answer, the family assumed Mrs. Tran might have had a relapse while on her way to the clinic. Consequently, no one thought to check the building's surveillance videos. Due to this, Mrs. Tran's family only focused on searching around the surrounding areas. Her tragic accident deeply shocked the building's residents, leaving them horrified. A series of questions remain unanswered, raising concerns and chills. First, there was a serious oversight in building management. Why was the 6th floor allowed to bypass safety regulations by installing an iron gate, blocking the elevator entrance? Second, if the 6th floor was unoccupied, why wasn't the elevator programmed to skip that floor? And why had no accidents occurred before, after the iron gate installation? Third, after the incident, investigators found a perplexing fact. After conducting an on-site inspection, they discovered that the building's soundproofing was actually poor. If someone shouted loudly on the 6th floor, people on the 5th and 7th floors could clearly hear it. To this day, these questions remain unanswered. An additional fact is that the iron gate wasn't installed by the current owner of the 6th floor. He had merely locked it. The gate was originally installed by the floor's first owner, a martial artist who used the 6th floor as a training area. Not wanting to be disturbed by neighbors, he had installed the iron gate to protect his private space. Eventually, the new owner of the 6th floor only lived there briefly and didn't consider removing the iron gate. Thinking it wouldn't affect anyone, he later moved out, locked the gate, and unknowingly set the stage for this horrifying tragedy. Ultimately, the new owner compensated the victim's family with 700,000 NTD, while the original owner paid an additional 1 million NTD. This tragedy, which never should have happened, concluded this way. However, even now, this accident still sends chills down people's spines whenever it's mentioned. It's not only the untimely death of Mrs. Tran due to the iron gate, but also a mysterious spiritual factor. Her body was discovered during the 7th lunar month. People believe that some curse may have led to that fateful night when Mr. Trong coincidentally pressed the 6th floor button in a way similar to what Mrs. Tran would have done. Not long after, in an interview, Mr. Trong recounted that on that night, when he entered the elevator on the 1st floor, he felt as though he was accompanied by a middle-aged woman. Strangely, she just stared intently at him. When he reached the 6th floor and saw Mrs. Tran's body, he frantically looked around, but by then, the woman had vanished. When Mr. Trong looked back at the body, he realized it looked identical to the woman who had just shared the elevator with him. Although it's uncertain if this was some paranormal occurrence or merely a hallucination. Everyone who hears this story feels a deep chill and goosebumps. Whether this was a supernatural phenomenon or just an illusion remains unknown. But everyone feels an eerie sense of fear when hearing Mr. Trong's story.